podcast.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm Joel.
And I'm Rick. Glad you're here with us today.
I want to talk about something today that I actually don't really want to talk about, but I think it's such an important issue, and it's the idea of submission. Now, before you turn off the podcast, I want to say I've struggled with this idea for a long time because I think the idea of what submission is, I think, has been, first of all, it's been abused. So
Yeah.
what I specifically remember is growing up, being under a lot of people that would use their position and say, "You need to submit to me. I'm your spiritual authority." I remember one time I went to the youth pastor I was telling him I'm going to be leaving a church, and he told me, "Well, you need to submit to your spiritual authority, which is the pastor." And the church was so big, I had never even talked to the pastor face to face, and I was like, "How do I submit to the pastor as my spiritual authority?" And the dude's never even like been in my life, and so I've just had a problem with, well, I've probably had some problem with submission my whole life, which is what landed me in the principal's office on a regular basis. But I want to talk about that. I guess the first question is, what is submission for?
Yeah. Well, submission is really it's a protection for ourselves, and it's also a route to power. It's a route to faith. You see in Scripture. Hopefully, you can explain how that is. I'll
That's
make a
very
little note here.
counterintuitive.
It's a route to faith. By nature, we're all rebels because we're sons and daughters of Adam. Okay, and what did Adam and Eve do? They rebelled against God. He gave them one little simple rule: don't eat that tree over there. And that's the thing they immediately did. So by nature, we're all rebels. By nature, we all want to do what we want to do when we want to do it the way we want to do it. And that's the way of the serpent as well. But the other side of it is when authority, people who are speaking all the time about you need to submit, people who are always speaking about authority really indicate that they don't have authority.
Isn't that so true? Yeah. We know who's really in authority, and they don't have to go, "I'm in charge."
Yeah, you don't have to tell somebody, I'm in charge if you really are in charge. And oftentimes that legalism, that this is the way you have to do it, that's kind of their way of covering for their own insecurity and covering for their own lack of authority. But when I say like authority is a protection, for example, let's just take a little kid, and you start as a kid and you grow up. A child that is not under the authority of his parents walking down a sidewalk, and if he's not under the authority of his parents, he darts out in front of a car, boom, he's dead, And so by being under the authority of his parents, because his parents are further than him, can see further than him, have understandings and experiences that he doesn't, he can't understand that, what's the danger in a parking lot? Parking lots are really dangerous, especially for little kids.
Yeah, I get nervous every time Elise wants to run in the parking lot.
Yeah, people backing out, and they can't see that little head down there below the trunk of their car. But kids can't experience that. They've never driven. We would drive in Latin America, and we'd be driving at night, and there's people walking in all black, and they're walking right alongside the road.
I remember that.
And you're going, are you crazy?
I don't know.
But they figure, I can see the car, so if I can see you, you can see me. And they've never driven. They don't understand reflections. They don't understand trying to see through a mirror at night and all that. And so they just don't know.
Or in the fog. I would see them walking in the fog like that. I'm like, oh my gosh, do you have a death wish? But they don't realize that they're not.
They've never driven, and so you've never experienced that. And so by submitting ourselves to authorities, then there's a protection that comes to that. The other thing is that all authority, this is powerful. This is in Romans 13. It says, all authority comes from God. So there's no authority that didn't originate with God. So then it goes on to say, so if you're resisting an authority, and that would be any authority because all authority comes from God. So if you're resisting an authority, you're actually resisting God himself.
In every case. This is where I get, this is tricky.
In every case. For example, and here's an interesting example in the Old Testament where the children, Samuel was the leader. He was the priest. He was the leader of Israel. And the people come to Samuel, and they say, we want a king. And Samuel's kind of discouraged a little bit. And God says, look, Samuel, they didn't reject you. They rejected me.
Because up to that point, Samuel was the kind of the spokesperson for God.
He was the prophet. He was the priest. And he was both prophet, priest, judge. It's during the period of judges there. And so he was kind of that transition from the period of judges to the prophets and to the kingdom. And so God's saying, they rejected me. And so when we reject an authority, and that's what it clearly says in Romans 13, 1, 2, 3, 4 of those first few verses, that all authority is established by God. Now, the problem is we simplistically say that, well, while, it doesn't matter if we vote because whoever gets elected, that's who God put into office. I don't think that's what it's saying. It's not saying every person was put there by God. What it's saying is the authorities that be were ordained or established by God. So the fact that there is a president of the company, the fact that there is a president of the country, the fact that there is a mayor, the fact that
So the
that person,
position, not the person.
the position exactly, is put there by God.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean it's necessarily a godly person in position. But even
Yeah.
if it's not, they're still exercising God's authority.
Which comes down to what they always taught us. You can respect the position without respecting necessarily
The
the
person,
person in it, because sometimes you don't respect
they're
the
ungodly, yeah.
morality of the person, but you can, yeah, which is something we've gotten away from. You saw, Christians that would, you know, not respect the office of president when, if they didn't like Obama, or now there's
Yeah,
Christians that don't like Trump, and you see them doing things, you're like, well, at least respect the office
right.
if you can't respect the person. But we have a hard time separating that at
And
this point.
it's not understanding even, and when you say the office, well, it's not really the office. It's respecting the fact that God, the authority that comes from the President of the United States comes from God. It's God's authority. It is all His.
Mm.
Now, Jesus, it's interesting because Jesus said this, all authority, just before He ascended back, He talks to His disciples, says, all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me.
Me, yeah.
Say given. Okay, so somebody else had it. It's God the Father's authority. He has invested it in Jesus, and then Jesus invests some of it us. When the disciples were going out, it said he gave them this is before they're even believers, really. I mean, they're just the disciples. They don't even know who Jesus is, really. He hadn't died or anything. And it says he gave them authority over demons. So even at that time, God had invested certain authorities into Jesus that he then invested in his disciples to go.
So that whole angle, which,
Hmm.
we would say, well, that's the biblical angle. That opens up a whole can of worms, because
Yeah.
the first thought that comes to my mind is the American Revolution was a sinful act against an authority.
That's a good question, and the American Revolution is a tough one.
I wrote a paper on that one time in college as a
Well, then
Christian.
tell us.
Well,
No,
no, I just remember a lot of people were like, "Whoa,
yeah.
whoa, whoa."
Well, that's the deal. You don't always obey an authority. Well, but that's not rebellion, okay? So I may have to disobey an authority, but I can disobey in a submissive way, or I can disobey in a rebellious way. So
So
let's
starting a
say,
war would probably be a rebellious way.
well, let's say or let's say, for example, that the king, the president, determines you shall not pray.
Okay.
Does this bring back bells, Daniel?
Yeah.
Okay, Daniel continued to pray, but he didn't say, well, by golly, that's bad, and you're a bad king, and I'm going to do what I want to do. That's a rebellious way. But so he wasn't in rebellion to the king, he was in submission to a higher authority.
Wow. Which is the same with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They said,
Exactly.
"Oh, king, sorry, we just can't do that."
And that's what the American Revolution is all about, too. They saw themselves not as rebelling against a king, although they did. And, we can't speak for their morality, but these are pretty smart guys. But they saw themselves as submitting to a higher authority, and that's why it starts off that we hold these truths to be self-evident.
Yeah, that
It's
all men are created equal.
created equal and are endowed by certain rights by their creator. And so, in other words, what they were saying is, King, you are in opposition to a higher authority.
Hmm.
And so we choose to submit to a higher authority, the Creator, who has endowed us with these certain inalienable rights, among the right, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and that those are given by God, and you are standing. So we're not rebelling against you as much as we're obeying a higher authority.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you then come and whether they should have armed conflict and all that, I don't know. That's another real arrogance we have, is that somehow we can judge another generation by our current
Yeah,
models.
that's
And
hard.
that's happening a lot today. Well, this 50 years ago, the guy did this and that was terrible. Not in that environment, not in that. And we do that with the Bible. Well, they went in and they killed everybody, and you go, you cannot judge in our context what was done there.
Yeah.
Because had you been there, you'd have understood, you'd have seen it. Just a whole
Which,
other world.
which is funny, because it's usually the people that say, "I'm so non-judgmental," that cast the harshest judgments on previous generations.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's the pride of it all.
And sometimes it's lack of understanding. Sometimes it's just you don't know what all was going on around there. You don't know what the environment would have been like had you
Yeah.
been there.
So I guess it was in the 70s, there was a really kind of overpowering, abusive Christianity that it was called the disciple movement. What was it
Yeah,
called?
there was a
The shepherding movement.
shepherding movement. Yeah.
And a lot of abusive leadership, kind of abusive spiritual leadership. And out of that came a book that I think you had me read it when I was 17, and I didn't get the depth of it then. But after getting bumped around in the church a little bit, I've started to realize the power of what's in it. And there's a book that's called The Tale of Three Kings, which I've seen Andy Stanley kind of recommend everybody read that. You've recommended read. I recommend anybody in ministry to read that. That book talks about the idea that submission's tricky because sometimes the authority that is there is just a horrible, horrible authority.
Right.
I mean, so why don't you unpack the essence of Tale of Three Kings?
Yeah, Tale of Three Kings is it's a story of, as you might guess, three kings. You would think the three kings of Israel, but they're not Saul, David, and Solomon. They are Saul, David, and Absalom, the son of David. And if you're not familiar with the story, well, you're probably familiar with the Saul and David story, where Saul is appointed king, and then David, God says, "I'm going to take the kingdom from you," and he anoints David, has Samuel anoint David as king. So now David's to be the king, but he doesn't take possession of the throne yet. And then when David does become king, his son Absalom is deeply offended by some things. David was a horrible father. We think of David as his great. He was horrible at a lot of things.
He was a horrible man in general.
He really
Killing a
was.
man to get his wife.
He was a horrible husband, a
Yeah.
horrible father. He was a great warrior. And the only thing David had going for him, he was quick to repent. In most cases.
Right.
I mean, even when Nathan, it took a year, and Nathan finally points him out. But then he did repent. You know, he could have had Nathan just beheaded and throw him in a ditch somewhere.
Which, again, the ironic thing about all this is he still gets called a man after God's own heart. You're like, what in the world?
But see, I think
hope for us all.
That speaks of who David was. I often thought, when we use the term, "Oh, he's a man after my own heart," it kind of means we have a special favoritism for him. I believe when it says David was a man after God's own heart, it's not saying God had a special favoritism for him. It was saying David was a man in pursuit of God's heart. Even though he was a man after. It was David it's describing, not God.
And he messed it up a bunch, but it didn't change the fact that he was trying.
Yeah, I'm still in pursuit of God's heart, as messed up as I am. In fact, if we all had that attitude, the more messed up I am, the more I need God.
Yeah, that's true.
Not the more I'm going to run from Him.
I'm getting my act together. I don't need God quite as much.
Yeah.
So, Tale of the Kings, Saul, David's anointed king, and then Saul starts chasing after David.
Right.
Which is where the story kind of picks up, if I remember.
Yeah. And it's a real easy read, and it's kind of done in a novel sort of format. Yeah, exactly.
Narrative type.
Kind of like a play or something. And so I would recommend it to anybody because there's some deep truths in there that if you read it and read it and read it again, especially if you've been hurt by the church.
Yeah.
And, if you haven't been hurt by the church, it means you haven't been around very long.
Just get ready. It's
you
coming.
will be, yeah. When people tell me, "Oh, I don't go to church because I got hurt by the church," I say, take a number, get in line. You want to compare scars?
Yeah.
I can match you scar for scar. But, well, I had a guy tell me, I think I may have shared this with you once before, Joel, a young hippie, when I was a new believer, he told me this. He was just long-haired, dirty guy and Christian. He said, "Just remember this. People in the church are going to do you bad, but Jesus ain't never done you nothing but good." I thought, well, okay, whatever that means, I don't know. I was just a new believer and getting ready to go in the Navy, 17 years old. But I remember many times when I thought, golly, I'm ready to just toss this in. I'm fed up with believers and how the way they treat one another. And then I just remembered, yeah, but Jesus, you ain't never done me nothing but good. Yeah. So I'm going to stick around for you.
Yeah.
And so anyway, the point is that if you're in the church, you're going to get hurt. I put it this way: you can't dance long enough and close enough with somebody without getting your toes stepped on. So what do you do when you get hurt?
And you still submit to a leader that's hurting you?
Yes and no. There are see, a lot of times you can step out of a situation. We can, I hate to say choose the authorities that we have in our lives, but you don't have to go to an abusive church. There are good churches. There are healthy churches out there.
Right.
And so you need to know, am I staying here because I feel like God wants me to be here because there's something for me? Or am I staying here because I'm afraid to leave? Am I afraid to appear to be a failure? Am I afraid to start relationships over again? Are you staying where you are because it's the Lord, or are you staying where you are because of your own insecurities and your own fears?
Right. Or yeah, which if you're prone, I mean, there are some people that are a little more prone to be tolerant of abuse.
Right. And
They're going to stay there. I mean, you think about people that don't get out of abusive relationships, like
right.
a marriage, because of some of their own insecurity
Well,
within
it's
them. That
my
will anybody
fault, and
else,
I deserve
yeah,
this,
or
and
will
yeah,
anybody else ever love me?
yeah,
Yeah. So that, I mean, that's where
yeah.
submission's tricky because
It
I
is.
see I've seen a lot of, I mean, I've been hanging out in the church for about 40 years. You've been there
Yeah.
longer. A lot of people use some really bad excuses for telling people to stay in some very dysfunctional things, saying, "Well, God's just teaching you.
Yeah.
God's teaching you through it." And you're like, "Yeah, he is, but like at some point it's it's just not wise to stay around."
Yeah. Well, here's one of the key things about submission and authority. Submission, or if you're submission is something that's given. It's not something that's demanded in a proper relationship.
Oh, okay. So I never heard you say that before. That's good.
Well, if I'm
Submission is
coming
given.
across with demanding that you submit to me, that's
That's that's
unhealthy.
tyranny, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But if I am in submission, then I am willfully saying, "Hey, you're the person God has put there. God's invested that power and that authority in you, and God's invested authority in all of us. So we all have somebody we're responsible
Which is an
for.
act of your own volition, your own will,
My own
saying,
choose.
"I'm choosing to submit to you."
Right.
But I mean, that turns it all on its head right there. Because what the big accusation of, like the oppressive patriarchy of the Bible and man, women
It's
having
not
to
that way at all.
submit to men, but it's really showing the power of a woman to say,
Yes.
"I'm strong. I'm totally equal to you." I mean, this is the way I see it, because I mean, I think of Emily as very strong and she's very equal to me. But she, in her strength, says, "All right, I'm gonna back off a little bit and let you take the lead."
It takes more power to submit than to be in
Yeah,
charge.
that's true.
It really does. Because you are saying, okay, because submission is not going, oh, okay, Sarah, whatever happens. But what it's saying is, God, I am trusting you to speak through my husband.
Right.
And
In the marriage context,
I'm
yeah.
not necessarily trusting him because he's a goofball. He is flawed.
That's
He
true.
makes mistakes. But God, and your mom does this a lot of times. I hope she doesn't say the goofball part, but she probably does. But she does this a lot of times where she said, okay, Lord, this sure seems like a wacky thing that he's onto, but I'm going to trust you that if this is not of you, you can change his heart.
And what a strong position to be in, to say, I could do something different. I could
Right.
leave. I mean, mom's a strong person too. They're both very strong women. And again, I think the Bible definitely teaches that there's women are, there's some physical elements that they're less, but it's not like they're valued less or
No,
anything.
no, value is equal. And
Yeah, but it's the woman is actually called to something that's harder than the man in some ways.
yeah, yeah.
She says, "Hey, uh, willingly." That's a mind blowing thought. But that's where I think submission gets distorted.
Well, that's where I say too that when I said earlier, submission is a key to power
Yeah,
and a key to faith. The perfect example we see in the Bible where there are two times. Think about this. Jesus was shocked. Jesus was surprised. How does God get amazed? He was never amazed by the faith of a Jew.
oh, I know where you're going. Yeah, the story.
Yeah, he was amazed by the faith of two Gentiles, though.
Yeah,
The woman who said, "Lord, heal my daughter," and wow, yeah, but even the dogs could eat the crumbs from under the master's table. And he was like, "Whoa, whoa," astounded by that. And the other one, the one I'm going to, was the centurion. And the centurion says, "You don't need to come to my house." He's got a sick child, sick servant, don't remember
yeah,
which.
servant, I think.
He says, "You don't need to come to my house. Just speak the word, and it'll be done." And Jesus is
Yeah,
amazed
he's
by
like, "I've never
this.
seen all this faith in Israel anywhere."
Yeah, he's amazed by that. And the guy says the most amazing thing. He said, the reason I know this is because I too, you'd think he was going to say, because I too am a man of authority. When I speak, people listen. But what he says is, I too am a man under authority.
Mm.
And when I speak and say, go here, he goes. Why does he go? Because I'm a man under authority. So this guy realized, I represent the entire Roman legion. I represent Rome and all of its power and all of its authority because I am under the authority of Caesar. So when I speak, this guy doesn't go, he might be bigger than me and might be able to take me down. But he realizes, I represent Rome.
Wow.
And so
It's like
because of that,
you got the big brother behind you,
right,
like the enforcer.
And that's the amazing thing. Like with a parent, for example, well, I'm the dad, by golly, I'm the one in authority. The only authority you have was given to you by God.
Well, that's a very humbling thing for, yes, you better be careful what you're claiming to be.
Right, because I'm going to stand before God and He's going to say, I gave you all that authority. What did you do with it? You abused your kids, you abused your wife. Who do you think you are?
Yeah.
And so, yes, I have authority. And so it's a frightening thing, really.
Isn't that the essence of the verse? It says, "Wives, submit your husbands as a husband submits to God."
Right, because
Yeah.
just as Christ is the head of the church,
Hmm.
you're the head of the family. And it isn't a matter of, is my head more important than my neck? No, you kind of need both of them,
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't want to get along without either of those, or your shoulders. And so it's not a matter of one being more important. It's not, but somebody has to make the ultimate decision.
Right.
And you don't want it to be a toss of a coin. And so the Lord has determined that the man would be the one that he would invest the authority in, and then it flows through the man to the wife, and she's the authority, and all of that authority flows down to the children, and I guess the kids over the cat and the dog or whatever. Nah, kids, when you're you're still learning. So
So here's still my issue, and it'd be nice if it was super black and white, but it
yeah,
gets really tricky when you're under an abusive, for example, an abusive husband.
yeah, and authority and submission. Submission is an attitude; it's not an action.
Right. So I've seen people that have gone against their parents' wishes because they know that God was calling them to do something else, but they managed to do it in an honoring way.
Yeah,
Um, it's so tricky because you have to do it with a lot of fear and trembling, I think,
exactly. Yeah,
because if you go into it and flippantly, well, it's we're always we've talked about this before. The extremes. We go one way would
hmm
be like, I ain't listening to nobody. Only God is my authority. I'll do whatever I want. You can get in some
and that's
big
rebellion.
trouble, right?
Yeah,
Or you can be like, well, I just listen to the person, and
I'm
God's
just
like,
trusting
I
God.
never told you to submit to that tyrannical authority.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Well, and that is the key in it. Again, authority or submission is an attitude, not an action. And so there might be times now when you're talking about parents and authorities like that, as you said, you really do need to be careful because God may be using them to. Well, now's not the right time. That may truly be God calling you, but maybe now's not the right time.
you're talking kids to parents, the parents that disagree with something they're about to
Right,
do. Yeah,
exactly. Like, well, I know God's called me into ministry, and Dad says, well, gee, I think you need to get a secular degree to have something to fall back on. Well, I'm not going to need to fall back on anything. Just listen to Dad.
yeah,
Just get the degree, and you know what? If it's God will use that,
yeah.
and you probably, I guarantee when you get back, you'll look back on it and go, that was pretty wise counsel. That was pretty good counsel.
Which is again super circular logic. So I got called on the carpet one time by a friend of mine, and I was talking about how you need to submit to the authorities that are, and he wrote me. He's like, "Didn't you smuggle Bibles into China?" And I was like, oh, "Snap,
But again,
yeah."
you're going at it from the perspective of I am not being rebellious against the authority. I'm being obedient to a higher authority.
Which I felt pretty proud of what I had done. So I think I was being rebellious. So
You
maybe I
probably
was in the
were,
wrong.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but that's an interesting thing you could get quickly called on if you
Yeah.
don't have the entire framework of what submission looks like, which is that's that's again the thing with all of Christianity is if you just take half of it, you're going to be miserable.
Right.
You got to
Yeah.
take the whole package.
Yeah.
It's like a Mac computer. It's got to be a closed system.
Yeah.
You can't just be in putting whatever programs or applications in. You got to take the whole system, and submission out of line with, but even in the context of in that you just go in with some fear and trembling because there may be times that God says for you to stay under what's seemingly
Yeah.
abusive because you're learning, or authorities are saying,
Well, David's the perfect example of that. We know that Saul was crazy,
yeah,
mad, insane, literally tormented, demon tormented.
a demon possessed leader.
Yeah, exactly. And
Some people feel like they have a
twice,
demon possessed boss.
yeah, here's the crazy thing. Twice, it's like God gives him into David's hands, says, here he is. He's in the cave. He's all by himself. You can kill him. Here he is. He's sleeping on the ground. And David cuts off the edge of his robe and feels badly about that. He said, oh my goodness, what have I done?
Wow.
And see, here's the crazy thing about that. It's like, I thought about that for a long time, and I realized that though Saul saw David as his enemy, David never saw Saul as the enemy.
Mm.
David was vicious against the enemies of God. I mean, he's out cutting off cutting off heads and killing Philistines by the scores and hundreds, and killing the enemies of God. But and I think that's the difference. He remembered Saul was part of the family. Crazy as he was, demon possessed as he was, wrong as he was still part of the family.
Yeah.
And so David would not attack him because he was part of the family, an Israelite.
We, there was a quote in A Tale of Three Kings where he basically says something like, you never, I mean, he says it over and over again. There's this
Yeah.
line, it's like, we don't know who is God's,
He wouldn't touch him because he was God's anointed. And you go, how can he be anointed?
yeah,
And the line is something about we can't tell who God has anointed and who he hasn't. We never know.
which comes back to respecting the position.
Right.
Wow, that's pretty potent because we may not know this side of this eternity, this side of the space time continuum. Like, oh
Yeah.
wow, I was following a tyrannical leader. Um, but if you're wow, but that gets tricky again because what about people who are like, well, I was just trying to follow Hitler.
Well, the other thing though
That's
yeah, but the other thing that David said was this. He said after he could have killed him on the ground there, they said, kill him. It's God's given him over to you. He said, you know what? Either God will take him out, or he will die in battle, or he'll pass away. In other words, if he had killed Saul, he would have become just like Saul.
yeah.
And so what God was doing was killing the Saul that was in David, because Saul was a humble man. He was a good man. He really was a great guy until he became king. And all of a sudden, then he's grasping for that. He had the good life, you might say, and he wouldn't release that because he knew that David was going to be the next king. And so he tells Jonathan, he says, Jonathan, you're going to let this guy become king, and you're not even going to have your kingdom. Jonathan didn't care. And if Saul hadn't been grasping for that power, he could have said, David, it's obvious God's anointed you as king. Samuel told me God was going to take the kingdom away, give it to another person. It's obvious it's you. You have at it. I'm going to go home and enjoy my grandkids.
Mm.
He could have just given up the kingdom. And you say, well, no king gives up the kingdom for somebody else. You go, well, wait a minute. I know a guy named Jesus who
Yeah.
was the king, who laid, and he could have just done that, but he was grasping for the power. I got to hold on to this. And had David killed Saul, he would have been doing the same thing, grasping for the power outside of God's time.
So if you feel called to, I hate to say rise up against a position of authority, how do you know? This is something I'm just thinking again. It's much fear and trembling with a lot of counsel. Well, for example, I mean, once it became clear what Hitler was doing, people rose up and like took him
Mm-hmm.
out. They didn't like who's. Here's the thing. Sometimes people claim to be your authority that aren't really your authority, and they need to be. It needs to be addressed. Like, how do you know who really is your authority and who? And then you have freedom to go after their. Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
Well, in the Hitler situation, again, it's a matter of not being rebellious against the leader who's in authority here in this country, but being obedient to a higher authority.
Right.
You take, the Corrie ten Boom. We're going to hide the Jews because I'm being obedient to a higher authority.
Right.
Bonhoeffer, the attempt to kill Hitler, I'm being obedient to a higher authority.
Which again gets really tricky because I think about people here that are saying, illegal immigrants. They feel like their job is to, and we won't go into the political side of this,
Right.
but I mean, there's a lot of people that genuinely feel like I've got to protect these illegal immigrants because I'm answering to a higher authority. And then other people say, what are you doing? The authority is this regional authority, and when they've come under the authority of this government, they are
Yeah.
now under this authority. I mean, if I like when I go to Peru, I got to follow their rules, right?
Right.
So
Well, the difference is, if you're fighting against the rules of a country, that's what they're doing. They're saying, I don't like the laws of this country.
mm-hmm.
But those aren't biblical laws. The biblical laws were what Hitler was dealing with. He's massacring Jews.
Yeah.
That's a biblical law. You don't do that. If our country were murdering, immigrants in here and they were just rounding them up, murdering them, then that would be God's law. And well, we need to protect them. We need to help them. We need to do whatever. If you just don't like the laws of the land, but they're laws, it's neutral.
Which in our country, fortunately, we have the option. If you want to change them, you vote people in that'll change them.
Yeah.
But I mean, for people, I think about people in Africa or under tyrannical regimes. That's a whole nother level.
Well, and here you get into a whole other thing too, because is this, I know friends who feel like it's their Christian duty to get politically active, and I say that's extracurricular.
Hmm.
How how active was Jesus politically?
He said about one or two things, and they were very ambiguous.
And only when he was
Yeah,
asked.
like yield unto Caesar what Caesar, give to Caesar what Caesar's.
Yeah,
And then he called him an old fox or something like that. Or
yeah. And
Herod,
when
was it Herod?
They said,
Yeah.
"Hey, Herod's asking to see," he said, "I'll tell that old fox I don't have time for him," type of thing. But you see, the time if he was going to rail against the government, and he could have. I mean, my goodness, it was oppressing God's people and all that, you know. But
Yeah, very clearly oppressing God's people.
the time he could have railed on him was when the word comes that John the Baptist has been beheaded. Oh, that Herod, we got to rise up. That's terrible. This is wrong. Yada yada. All he said was, John was a good man. That's it. That's all he said. And because again, it's almost like he was here representing another kingdom. He was.
Wow.
And so, as believers, yeah, because we live in America, get involved in the politics, but that's all, unless God calls you to that arena,
Yeah.
which there are those I believe God calls that arena. But for most of us, do your civic duty, but that's extracurricular. That's not part of being a believer. That's all extracurricular. It's like, maybe you want to join the knitters club or something. That's great. Go be a knitter, do all that stuff. But that's not part of your Bible life. That's not part of
Right.
your Christian walk. That's extracurricular. Do it in your spare time.
Which a lot of people would say that, if you don't, I mean, that's, people would say, well, we're called to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before God. And if justice is not being done by the government, we need to step up and do the justice.
You don't see Jesus doing that, though. That's the thing about it. People confuse what's personal responsibility with what's government responsibility. And that we get into trouble when we try to make the government do the stuff that we're supposed to do. We're to do justly.
Wow. So
We're to love mercy.
abdicating responsibility to
Yeah.
somebody else that we're supposed to take ourselves.
I'm not going to be able to make my government do justly. The government was established for two purposes by God.
It'd be nice if they were just.
It would be. Yeah, wonderful. Scripture says, when the righteous rule, the people rejoice.
Yeah.
But that doesn't always happen. And the government, biblically, the government has two responsibilities. I think it's in Timothy. It says to reward those who do right and to punish those who do wrong. That is the whole purpose for government. Reward those. When it's doing things beyond that, and that's where the American Revolution came in, when it's doing things beyond that, then it is exceeding its God ordained authority and it's becoming a tyranny. And so, and you could get into all that and you have a revolution, but the point is well, like this, for example, and this will explain what I was talking about, where it says that confusing my responsibility with government's responsibility. Jesus said this, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, and if I were sitting there listening, I'd say, wait a minute, I haven't heard that said. You said that. That's Bible, man.
But that was the code of Hammurabi. I mean, that had been carried out for years.
That's in the Old Testament. That's the law of God. God said, thou, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But what did Jesus say? He didn't say, I'm doing away with that. He said, and here's where you put the emphasis. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, he wasn't talking to the government.
He was talking to the
government
individuals.
still has to do eye for eye, tooth for. I say unto you, turn the other cheek. Okay. If you apply that to the government, well, I know you killed 20 people, but we're going to turn the other cheek, turn you loose. The government cannot do that.
Then that's where you get into the unjustness of the government. We're letting people get away with stuff that's going to cause havoc in the land.
Right. And the government, those laws were given for the government. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, all those things still apply for government. But I say unto you, turn the other cheek. I say unto you, what is old man? He has shown you, old man, what is good, what does the Lord desire? What does the Lord desire of you? Do justly. You love mercy. You walk humbly.
Yeah.
If you're in a position where you can bring that into the government, awesome. But if you're going in to try and overthrow the government, to force them to be, they will never be just. They will never love mercy. Even in Israel, the closest we had to a biblical situation, it was still faulty people that ran it.
Which comes back to the idea that submission is really only submission when you're willingly giving your authority, giving over that card to somebody who probably doesn't deserve it.
Certainly not.
But you're still saying, okay, I'm strong enough to where I'm going to submit a little bit to you.
Trusting God.
Trusting God.
The whole bottom is trusting God. And again, keeping in mind then that the problem is well, it's kind of like Jordan Peterson says, just learn to clean up your room. If you'll clean up your own room, if you'll do justly, if you'll love mercy, if you'll walk humbly, the government's going to do what it does. And that's why Jesus, he says, I say unto you, turn the other cheek. I'm not telling Herod to do that. I'm not telling Rome to do that. I'm not telling Caesar to. If you'll just do that, your world and the world in which you revolve will be a better place.
If you liked what you heard, please consider sharing this with a friend. For more information, visit joelmalm.com or rickmalm.com. Thanks for listening.